Bon, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vous propose de...
Hello everyone. I suggest that we start this meeting. I will speak French. I am Christophe Clergeau, the new MEP since June the 2nd at the committees Agri and all the questions that are at the forefront of all the stakes in agriculture and that are very, and nutrition that are very specific to the issue that we will be dealing with today. I would like to thank Jutta Paulus for organizing this session. She will be with us in a few minutes. We thank both teams for all the work behind the organization and all of you for your presence. We thought it was very important to organize this session today. I don't know if it's just one more on glyphosate so far, but it was important to clarify things 1 month before the decision that will be made by the scope of the competent committee on this issue. We've already had commissions with avis and agri, decisions made by the commission, but the truth is today we don't know what the commission's proposal will be exactly. We spoke of a decision that might be taken on 12 and 13 October. So we are dealing with extremely short times, and these issues are extremely important, and that is why, to me and my colleagues, we thought it was very important to have some debate, exchange on such an important matter regarding the different analyses, as this topic is very complex, so it is only natural that there would be some controversy around it. And we would like to keep stressing the scientific stakes of this topic. We noted that there are several publications of European agencies or other important scientific institutions that are contradicting with a continuous controversy going on. Jutta and myself are very keen to put science at the center of this whole topic so that we are able to use science to clarify, and that doesn't seem to be the case so far. We saw the publishing by the EFSA on many matters. It seemed that there were missing protocols in the research or missing information, and we all know that in scientific evaluation processes there are always missing elements. However, on such important and essential elements that deal with our health and our environmental impact, we need to know in what kind of decision situation we are finding ourselves. Is it fully informed, and does it allow for a good evaluation of the costs and benefits? Are we in a situation of precaution where there are strong uncertainties and identified risks that aren't fully informed, but that, however, should be taken into account within the decision? All these questions remain important because, as many have said so far, these agencies have a role. They invest time and means that were allotted to them, and the commissions have other roles, which is to make a decision. So thank you for soliciting us and encouraging us to organize this event and to help us mobilizing the different researchers. And Jutta will get back to this in conclusion, but I would like to initially just say that this parliament is asking itself the question of how to intervene within this process, given that it is a matter of execution and not of delegation. If we are not well informed, we will not have the possibility to object, to say no to the proposal of the Commission. We have no power, no real power to object. And there was a session in the Strasbourg Parliament with an open debate to in a plenary session on the request of many groups as well as a debate that would lead to a resolution that would allow the Parliament to give its own viewpoint and its position before a decision made by member states within the scope of. However, given that it is aspirable that the Commission would take the most clear position and decisions possible, because it would be very negative to have a blurred decision, an unclear one, with too much margin for the member states to redefine the glyphosate renewal, first of all, on a European level, but also the modalities, conditions for its use. I will stop now and give the floor for a few minutes to Angeliki Lysimachou. I'm not sure if I pronounced it well, to give the pan-Europe point of view, and then we will get back on the debates with the civil society.
To those who are following online as well. And thank you for organizing this meeting today. Very timely and very crucial meeting. We hope to have an insight on the question that you can see, is glyphosate safe for health and the environment? A very important question, taking into account that glyphosate is the most popular pesticide right now used in Europe and the world. And apparently, its human biomonitoring studies have shown that it is detected in our urine and also in the urine of children. So it's really important to answer this question. In 2017, we had IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, who classified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. This class of carcinogens in Europe should not be authorized as pesticides for agriculture. Nevertheless, it was authorized. And here I would like to... Okay, great. So back then in 2017, we had the European Citizens Initiative, where over 1 million people signed and asked the regulators to ban glyphosate because of the impact on human health and the environment. And as a response, because of these concerns, the license of glyphosate was renewed for 5 years instead of the original 15. And here we are again, 5 years later, to reassess the toxicity of glyphosate. These 1 million people are still with us, but we thought to put a question again to the European citizens and ask them, once more, if they would like to see the use of glyphosate continue in Europe or not. We asked 6 countries. I'm not sure where I need to, okay. And here are the results from Denmark, France, Germany, Poland, Romania, and Spain. And as you can see, 62% of European citizens, they said that they thought that the use of glyphosate should be banned. And what's interesting is only 14% is supporting the renewal. So the European citizens are still asking for a ban. This is the result of this poll. And we hope you take this into consideration in the next decisions. And here we'd like to also take the opportunity and announce that there is an action of citizens outside the Parliament today at 4:30, and we invite you to take part. And with no further delay, I give you the floor again.
Thank you. Alors, comment nous allons organiser?
So how will we organize our debates? We have asked the different agencies and the Commission to recall the key elements of what they had undertaken in their works. So both will have the difficult challenge to give us their key elements in 5 minutes each. So it will be the ECHA, the EFSA, and the Health DG. Hence, I would ask the different scientists to present their works here. There are several presentations on which Jutta will comment afterwards. And after these presentations, we will give the floor to these agencies and to the Commission in order to open a debate among us. You know the rules at the EP. We have 2 hours. 2 hours does not mean 2 hours and 5 minutes. It is 2 hours because there are the interpreters whom we salute and thank, and the interpreters thank as well. So we truly invite you to respect the allotted time for your presentations. We will hence see the key elements of the European institutions first. I hence give the floor to Mike Rosenberg and Paul Ryan for the head of Unit Hazard, and then to Manuela Tiramani for the head of Pesticides, and Klaus Behrendt for the head of Unit Pesticides and Biocides. They are connected online and we do not hear them, unfortunately. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me?
Can you please double check that you're not muted from your side? That the microphone is on, tabletop on your table? We cannot hear you right now. Is your laptop unmuted? We're going to refresh your connection. You should be back in a few seconds, and please allow every microphone and camera when you log in. Thank you.
OK. Donc, je donne la parole à l'EFSA, puis nous retrouverons l'ECHA ensuite.
So we give the floor to the EFSA first, maybe.
For inviting us. Very good to be here and to give us another opportunity to present our work in relation to glyphosate. The main findings, scientific findings on glyphosate have been presented before the ENVI and the Agri committees in recent events. And that's not my presentation.
No, it's not the right one. EFSA.
Sorry, I continue, just not to miss the flow. And so it has been presented already before the ENVI and the Agri committee. And so today I would like to spend the few minutes available in outlining a few aspects which could come later in the debate, so I'm happy to present them already proactively. And these are the 3 aspects I will be focusing on in the next few minutes. First of all, semantics and the meaning of critical areas of concern. This has created a huge debate in the last weeks. And I would like, it's very important to reiterate that the definition has a specific meaning within the regulatory framework. And this means that it's identified when the risk assessment shows that no uses among those proposed by the applicant will meet the approval criteria. So what makes the difference is the word critical. The absence of word critical doesn't mean that the substance is just fresh water. It means instead that there are concerns and that there are also uses which do not pose safety issue. So it doesn't mean that all uses proposed do not pose concern. So we are not saying, EFSA is not saying glyphosate is all green, wonderful and special. EFSA is saying that out of all uses proposed, some will not pose safety concern, and that glyphosate can be used under certain conditions. And I would like also to add that this framework under which we categorize our data gap, the concerns, is in place since 2021, and several conclusions have been published since. So I would assume that nobody has so far picked up this as an issue, but only it happened today. And I also think that this aspect of the categorization, which is the result of a continued discussion with the member states and the Commission, is pointing out very clear to the separation between risk assessment and risk management. That's exactly the purpose of this structure. Of course, we are happy to keep on improving, but absolutely, this identify the different roles. And I would say with this that goes strongly against the allegations that EFSA is influencing the decision-making process. The second point is the science behind underpinning the assessment. I would like to reiterate again, as did by my directors already in the previous hearings, that this is the most comprehensive assessment ever done. And so the final conclusion is based on a total of 2,400 studies, 700 of which comes from the literature. What makes the difference in assessing all this information is the weight of evidence. The data can be contradicting, but they have to be looked together in a weight of evidence. And everybody dealing with risk assessment knows this. It's not a single outcome changing the picture, it's the overall picture. And just to conclude, transparency. I think, and we are very happy about the result of the public consultation on glyphosate. It helped us immensely in completing as much as possible the body of data available. And last week we published the last batch of the so-called background documents. And so all the information now is publicly available. And now it's time for the authorities and the risk managers to go further in the process. So I close it here, and of course I remain available for the next discussion later today. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for focusing the topic in just a few minutes. This will simplify the debate. We now give the floor to the ECHA. Hopefully the connection works.
Perfect. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting us today to be part of the debate. We have 5 minutes, so I'll move straight to the slides if that's okay. So my name is Paul Ryan. I'm the head of unit responsible for classification and labelling in ECHA, and beside me is Mike Rosenberg, director. You can go to the next slide already. So just a reminder, you heard from EFSA, from Manuel already, about the second step in the process. Ours is actually the first step. So where ECHA's Committee for Risk Assessment does an assessment, a standardized assessment of the chemical properties according to the CLP regulation. So we look at the hazard, which means intrinsic hazardous properties, like cancer, like mutagenicity, like reprotoxicity, and many other things. And we provide an opinion via our committee. And this opinion was delivered in May 2022. The second step I will skip. So a few words about the Committee for Risk Assessment, if you go to the next slide and the next one. So a few words, first of all, about the independence of the committee and how it works. So this is a statutory committee established under the REACH regulation. All the members are nominated by the member states, and they act as independent scientists. So they're nominated and they're appointed by ECHA's management board. They're carefully vetted for any conflicts of interest, and they have annual declarations. So we have a robust system to ensure independence and to avoid conflicts of interest. Currently, we have 41 members and 5 co-opted members. These are all scientists. These are people who work on this COP regulation every day. And we have, of course, stakeholders, both civil society and also industry, but who are subject to the rules of procedure and conflicts of interest as normal. Next slide, please. So a few extra words about their experience and expertise. So you can see on the slide here, we have over 550 opinions on harmonized classification and labeling over the past 15 years. So quite some work has gone through the committee on looking at and assessing chemicals against the CLP criteria. And this is quite important, I think, for the debate here, that it's against the CLP criteria that the committee works. And these are the experts in Europe for looking at the properties of substances and weighing them against the CLP criteria. So we deliver balanced, independent opinions. I think we could say the system has delivered quite a number. As you can see that on the slide here, 145 substances have received a severe classification over the past 15 years, so for carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, or reprotox, including many pesticides. So we have a robust system that is delivering. Next slide, please. So a little bit about glyphosate and the outcome. You can go straight to the next slide. In this current evaluation of glyphosate, we had all the relevant data, both published and unpublished studies. We have an open process at ECHA, so we actually have an open consultation where we get additional information, and quite some information was added during the process. This is an up-to-date and complete assessment. So the second, as you know, we had one 5 years ago. This latest assessment is based on a dossier which was prepared by 4 member states. So we had France, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Sweden, with a variety of experts across Europe looking at this and putting lots of information into the dossier. So we had a robust starting point for the assessment. Our work then begins when we get the dossier from the member states, and we have to follow the CLP criteria. So all the evidence, both positive and negative findings, has to be weighed to come to a conclusion and a recommendation. Guideline studies and studies that follow standardized procedures are preferred. So like GLP is written here, so good laboratory practice. Poorer quality studies or less relevant studies are not dismissed, but they're given a lesser weighting. So this is how the process works at ECHA. And just a reminder in the last point here that only the active substance is evaluated under CLP, so formulations are not part of our process. Next slide, please. A few words on the carcinogenicity, because we're going to discuss it later. Firstly, on statistical analysis of tumour instances, this has been thoroughly examined on 2 occasions now, in 2017 and again in 2022. Lots of robust assessment by the member states involved, and again by RAC on both occasions has looked at this in much detail. On mutagenicity and oxidative stress, which is a topic for today, again, I just want to reassure you this was discussed by RAC in some detail. Oxidative stress is a mechanism. It has to be weighed against all the other information that we have and the animal studies and the human data, and this was what was done by RAC. As I mentioned already, our process is open, and we have heard many different arguments. We had opportunities in the open consultation, but also at RAC to hear a lot of the arguments on these points, and that was done. And again, we've openly communicated on this, on the opinion on our website, and we've responded to many questions up until this point from yourselves in Parliament and from other places, so you can refer to our website for those responses. Next slide, please. And then the next slide again. So just some key points to sum up. So our assessment was done according to European law. We followed international guidelines and standards. We've included all the relevant information, including the latest studies. The assessment, as I said, was initial assessment by a large group of experts from member states, from scientific institutes, from academic institutions across Europe, from 4 member states on this occasion, looking at all the data and putting together a dossier, which then moved on into the ECHA process and was looked at by the committee, which you've heard about too, how that's built. And the outcome was a clear consensus among RAC members. So we didn't have a minority opinion. There was a clear agreement on carcinogenicity and the other endpoints. Important to note also that there is an option in CLP to classify as category 2 when you have a suspicion. but no clear evidence. This was not taken by the RAC committee, so there was a consensus for no classification. And as I mentioned earlier, oxidative stress as a mechanism which can lead to further effects was assessed by RAC during our process. Thank you very much. I hand back to the room.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais donner...
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to the Commission with maybe a question. Our scientific expert will go back on some specific point, but now I would like to discuss a bit more about the weight of evidence. This is the work of the agencies, but how, being confronted with such high risks for health or environment, because in some cases there are some real risks that have been put forward. Here's our colleague Jutta Paulus. What is the process followed by the Commission? Do you take the opinions in the conclusion? Do you work in the principle of communication to deal with this risk?
Everybody here in the room and those following online. Like the other speakers, I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting us to be present here today and explain indeed how we now follow up on the opinions from EFSA and ECHA on glyphosate. And let me first underline that the principle of a high level of protection of human health and the environment is indeed a core element of the EU food safety rules, including for the legislation on pesticides. And the Commission is fully committed to ensure that only active substances are approved or the approval is renewed when it has been shown in the light of the latest science that the approval criteria in the regulation are met. That is the case for glyphosate like for any other substance, and there are many on which we take decisions, as you all know. So these latest science for the Commission are the opinions from ECHA and EFSA, and you've just heard from them how they have prepared their opinions on the classification, but also the overall outcome of the risk assessment, the pesticides risk assessment, including the huge amount of documents and studies that were evaluated, the steps taken for involving the public and creating transparency. So for the Commission, these outputs are the fundamental base for our proposal in terms of renewal of approval or not. And in that context, I would like to mention that, as we already said in the hearings in the Agri Committee and also in the Envy Committee, that the outcome of the EFSA's conclusions and also the ECHA work for us are actually showing that the renewal of approval of glyphosate is possible. This, because as Manuela explained, this categorization of critical areas of concern or data gaps or issues not finalized is something that we have in all the conclusions from EFSA for all substances. And when there is or are critical areas of concern, and as Manuela explained, that means for all the uses that were proposed by companies, there are problems, then we do not renew or we do not approve the substance. When there are data gaps or issues not finalized, we, together with the member states as risk managers, we look at the nature of these gaps and issues not finalized, and together with the member states discuss and examine whether they can be addressed via appropriate conditions or restrictions that can then be enacted as part of the renewal decision by the Commission. And this is what we have also done for glyphosate. So, as is foreseen in the regulation that governs the renewal process, we initiated the discussions with the member states on the possible renewal already in July at a meeting on the 12th of July, so just a few days after EFSA adopted its conclusion. And we invited the member states to send us comments and reactions to our initial analysis of the EFSA conclusion, which has the form of a so-called renewal report or a draft renewal report. We plan the next meeting with the member states, Mr. Chairman, as you already noted, on Friday this week, to look at an updated version of this draft renewal report that takes into account the comments that we received from the member states. And we also plan to present the first draft of the regulation on the renewal for that meeting. And then the vote is planned for mid-October. In order to be able to adopt the final decision before the expiry of the current approval, which is on the 15th of December, as we all know. Now, some have mentioned that we are rushing things, and you also noted, Mr. Clergeau, that the time schedule is very tight. That is correct. That is because the current approval expires on 15th of December. And if we do not manage to adopt a decision before then, we have to extend the approval, as we already did last year when EFSA was delayed with its work. And Mrs. Paulus has criticized me many times already in the ENVI committee when we actually had to extend approvals. So as a final comment, I would also like to mention that PAN and other civil society organizations have already written to the Commissioner, pointing to points in the EFSA conclusion and the ECHA opinion that they do not agree with. And I'm sure we will hear some of those also today at today's event. And the Commission has asked EFSA and ECHA to react to that and respond to these points raised, because we agree with you that it's important to have clarity about all the scientific debate, while noting what Manuela said in particular, that what counts for us, and you asked the question also, is the overall outcome of the weight of evidence, while it is clear that there will always be some who might have a different view compared to the majority. I mean, this is something that we have for all active substances as well. So that's maybe where I stop for now.
Thank you. And just one factual question. Will you publish your draft before Friday meeting or not?
Yes, the moment we share the text with the member states, they will be published in the comitology register also. And we also plan to publish them on our website. We have created a special website for glyphosate also to make it easier to find the documents, because we know that the comitology register can sometimes be a bit difficult to navigate.
Okay, thank you very much. I will give the floor to Jutta and then ask the different scientist speakers to come with us, and I will leave a place to Jutta, and then we will intervene from the floor.
Thank you very much, and again, sorry for being a bit late. This day is quite crazy when it comes to meetings.
And there is some coffees for those who asked for, who are available just outside.
So if anyone needs to put their caffeine levels up, please go ahead now.
Yes.
It would be a good idea if we were all doing it at the same time and then being back in 2 minutes instead of people being on the run all the time. It's a pleasure. Okay, so I think nearly everyone has found his or her way back in with the suitable amount of caffeine. Now we are going to the part of hearing external scientists, speakers, experts on this very important matter. As we know, glyphosate is not only used in Europe, but it is increasingly more used globally, of course, and therefore it is quite a good idea to have this global perspective also with experts, which might have their main way of working outside of Europe, which is the case with our first expert, Christopher Portier. He's the former director of the US National Center for Environmental Health. And he's, let's say, a semi-retired expert in the design, analysis, and interpretation of environmental health data with a focus on carcinogenicity. And as you know, this has been a very much debated matter, especially among European citizens. And Christopher will join us remotely, as you can see, and he will maybe have an answer to the question, beside IARC's classification. We heard that ECHA and EFSA do not propose glyphosate to be classified as a carcinogen. Earlier, we raised your critique. Did the recent assessment convince you?
Is this working now?
Great, we can hear you perfectly.
Perfect, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I will say that in my career, I've been in charge of the US government's official list of known human carcinogens, and I have helped to write the guidelines for IARC, for EPA, as well as other countries around the world. So I've done quite a number of evaluations, and now I'm going to look at glyphosate. Next slide, please. These are my disclaimers. I have been involved in the court cases in the United States on glyphosate, but the opinions expressed here are my own. Next slide, please. Making a decision about whether a compound is carcinogenic or not involves not only the science, but processes and policy decisions within your governments. On the science side, the evaluation of the science goes back to a 1965 paper by Sir Bradford Hill, and many of the guidelines, I've got 3 of them here, ECHA's, EPA's, and IARC's guidelines, are based upon Bradford Hill's criteria, and that is what I will use in what I do here. Now, I can't avoid process. I am not a government, but nonetheless, you have to stick to some of the guidance that's in these documents if you're going to do this right, and I have done that. Next slide, please. Any review of the carcinogenicity of any compound requires that you look at 3 critical areas: epidemiology or human studies, biological plausibility or mechanistic studies, and animal cancer studies. If you fail to review properly any one of these 3, it's like you've created a 3-legged stool with one of the legs missing. It becomes very unstable, and it doesn't really stand on its own. So we're going to look at all 3 areas here. Next slide, please. There are a lot of epidemiology studies related to the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. These are the ones that did ever versus never exposed. Now, what you need to concentrate on in this slide is very simple. There's a vertical line in the middle that is blue. If you're not colorblind, hopefully you can see it. And to the right of that line is a shaded area. Any of the little squares to the right of that line in the shaded area are pointing toward an association of glyphosate with cancer, in this case, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Any with the little squares to the left are associated with no glyphosate association with the cancer. And what you see here is they are predominantly all to the right. The little stems on them that extend out from the little squares are confidence bounds, and that tells you something about how reliable that statement is about the strength of that evidence. Next slide, please. There are ways in which this evidence can be brought together in much more formal, objective manner. There are published meta-analyses. At the time that I did this slide, there were 5 published meta-analyses, or 4, that I relied upon. And again, all you need to see in this picture is that all 5 of those meta-analyses are to the right of that middle blue line at the bottom half of that screen. Next slide, please. Now, you also like to look at something called exposure response. Does the risk of getting the tumor increase with higher exposure to the chemical? In the case of glyphosate, the evidence is all over the board. There are studies that show positive exposure response. There are studies that show negative exposure response. There are studies that show all kinds of weird patterns. So you can't really make any decision on how well the exposure response is until you get into the very, very highest and longest levels of exposure. And then you start to see some positive findings, but with very few people involved in those cancers. Next slide, please. Now, one of those studies was heavily used by ECHA in their evaluation called the Andreotti study. The problem with the Andreotti study is that a third of the participants in the study actually didn't respond to the question about whether they're exposed to glyphosate. Didn't even respond to any questions because they didn't respond to the questionnaire. So what the scientists who did was they created a statistical model to fill in the blanks for those people who failed to respond. The accuracy of the predictions from their statistical model is 55%, 55.7%. If I were to just randomly choose whether somebody's exposed or not, I'd have 50% accuracy. This is an extremely bad interpolation of the data into the areas where people didn't respond. This creates what is known as exposure misclassification. And in this case, it reduces the risk estimate possibly to below zero. So this study had very little chance of seeing a positive effect, and in fact, it did not see a positive effect. This study should be given little or no weight in the overall evaluation. Next slide, please. Overall, the evaluation of epidemiology, I can't walk you through every study. There is a positive association that exists between glyphosate formulation and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Causal inference is credible. You cannot rule out chance, bias, confounding, and exposure misclassification. This is not uncommon in looking at epidemiology studies. This is the definition of limited evidence of carcinogenicity from the CLP in the ECHA guidance document. This should automatically result in at least a classification of suspected human carcinogen or number 2 in the CLP. Next slide, please.
Christopher, we have about 1 minute left, right?
Oh, well, then let's just quickly go on. Next slide. When you look at animal cancer studies, you have to be careful how you do it. Next slide, please. I looked at all of the studies. All you need to look here is at the orange ones. Those are clear evidence. I feel that there's more than enough clear evidence here of animal carcinogenicity studies. Next slide, please. This falls into the definition of what is sufficient evidence for carcinogenicity in animals and should be automatically a 1B in the CLP. The next slide just shows that genotoxicity and oxidative stress are there as known mechanisms. And finally, I answer your question. Next slide, please. Is glyphosate safe for health and the environment? No, it can cause cancer in humans. It should be in CLP category 1B. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I think this was very, very impressive. And I would be very interested, of course, to learn especially why the Andreotti study was, I mean, if you get no answer from those participants, why don't you just exclude them from the study? That would be, at least for my perception, the more natural thing to do. But yeah, never mind. Maybe we will get an answer to that. But before that, we will go on to our next presenter, which is, wait a minute, Peter Klausing. He's senior toxicologist, glyphosate expert for Pesticide Action Network Germany, and he has a career in regulatory toxicology and is a co-author of a recent study on oxidative stress and glyphosate, which we have just heard about by Christopher. And 3 independent scientists who participated in the discussions of ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee. Well, here's one of them. Please, it's your turn. Take the floor. And you recently published that study. And do you think oxidative stress is the game changer which we actually need for correctly assessing the risk of glyphosate? And again, 8 minutes, please.
Okay, Thank you very much also for the invitation. It's part of the game changer, if it would be a game changer. And I decided to read my presentation to avoid that I'm told that the 7 minutes are over, so please excuse me. We heard a lot of about weight of evidence, and I will look at the weight of evidence in detail. And the point of reference is, next slide please, is ECHA's own definition of the weight of evidence approach, which combines information from different sources when studies provide conflicting results. And we heard about this several times today. Next slide. According to the CLP regulation, a category 1B is defined as sufficient evidence inter alia as increased tumor rates in at least 2 independent studies of one species. Okay, for glyphosate, there are 5 independent carcinogenicity studies in mice with increased tumor rates in all studies, although not all tumor types are seen in every study. Therefore, I agree with ECHA that this is a case for a weight of evidence assessment. But I disagree with the way ECHA has performed this assessment. I use kidney tumors as an example, but similar inconsistencies of ECHA's approach exist for other tumor types too. For kidney tumors, there was an increase in the majority of studies, which is to say in 3 of 5 studies. Nevertheless, ECHA concluded that this is not likely to be treatment related. And the question is, how can this be? Next slide. ECHA's first argument is that in 2 of the studies, the top doses were higher than 1,000 milligram per kilogram, and therefore these 2 studies are not relevant for the assessment. However, such a limit dose of 1,000 milligram per kilogram does not exist for carcinogenicity studies, in particular not if ECHA itself refers to an OECD guideline, which is only for carcinogenicity studies. Instead, this is for good reasons, and instead this false application of a limit dose has been defined for chronic toxicity studies. In conclusion, according to this so-called limit dose, all 3 studies remain relevant. Next slide. There are 2 different methods of statistical evaluation, pairwise comparisons and trend tests. ECHA documents increases when trend tests are used, but subsequently only uses this non-significant results of pairwise comparisons. This violates applicable OECD guidance for the analysis of tumor data in several aspects. First, OECD explicitly recommends trend tests. Second, OECD states that, I quote, significance in either kind of test is sufficient to recognize the results. And third, OECD accepts even non-significant increases if they are biologically plausible. As I will show later, this is the case for kidney tumors, and on the next slide we will see that the historical control data, which are an important weight or component of the weight of evidence concentrations, have been abused by ECHA too. ECHA claimed that the kidney tumors, I quote, were not likely to be treatment related because the findings were within historical control ranges. This is simply not true. As you can see here on the slide, the tumor rates of the studies of 1983 and 1997 were about twice as high as the historical control data upper range. And for the 2001 study, the historical control data would need to be scrutinized based on more detailed information, which cannot be done in this place and at this time. In conclusion, historical control data support the study findings instead of supporting the opposite. Next slide. And now we come to the oxidative stress, which has been mentioned earlier too. ECHA claims that the kidney tumors, and I quote, were not likely to be treatment related because there was no plausible mechanism. Again, the opposite is true. Oxidative stress is a known mechanism for carcinogenicity, either by causing genotoxicity or by direct action. Oxidative stress has been shown for glyphosate in multiple studies, including several epidemiological studies in humans. Important for our consideration is that oxidative stress has been shown in kidneys of male mice. This is to say, in the same species, the same sex, and the same organ where the tumors have been observed. In other words, there is a plausible mechanism for the kidney tumors. To summarize, next slide, please. ECHA dismissed important elements of the weight of evidence by making untrue statements. In our opinion, there is sufficient evidence for a category 1B classification of glyphosate. In contrast, ECHA did not even consider category 2. To illustrate the dishonesty of this, we will have a quick look at the category 2 criteria. According to ECHA, category 2 is adequate if evidence for carcinogenicity is restricted to a single experiment. In our case, we have 5 studies with increased tumor rates, and our example, kidneys, 3 studies out of the 5 with kidney tumors statistically significant, supported by historical control data, and supported by a plausible mechanism. According to ECHA, category 2 is adequate if there are, quote, unresolved questions regarding the design, conduct, or interpretation of the studies. Here we have been talking about 5 studies which have been declared as or assessed by ECHA as valid. And finally, category 2 is considered adequate if a substance causes increased rates only of benign tumors. Here we have malignant tumors in all 5 studies, including renal carcinoma in the kidney tumor studies I have been talking about. So in conclusion, ECHA's decision for no classification of glyphosate, in my opinion, I'm sorry to say that, is unscientific and based on untrue statements to support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I must admit, I also was surprised by the sudden cutoff of the 1,000 milligram per kilogram, because, I mean, not everyone knows it, but I used to be quality control manager in an analytical laboratory, and we often were actually commissioning toxicity and genotoxicity studies, which we would not perform ourselves, but where we would find partners to do them for. And so I do know a bit about the OECD guidelines for the performance of these studies. So I also was a bit surprised at this, at what ECHA opinion was claiming here. But I'm not here for talking. Rather, I would like to introduce Michael Antoniou. Pardon? Yes, he's the head of the Gene Expression and Therapy group at King's College, and he has been leading scientific. Oh, Daniele, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry to hear that. I wasn't aware that we had changed the series. So, Dr. Daniele Mandrioli, toxicologist, director of the Zaller Maldoni Cancer Research Center, Ramazzini Institute, and he has launched the most comprehensive study on glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides. And of course, we would be very much interested to learn what are the main findings. Is it safe to use? Are our children safe if they consume glyphosate? What did you find in your huge work of assessing all the scientific data? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present today the findings of the global glyphosate study. And I'm trying to move my slides. Can I? Should I? Let me see here. Okay, so the global glyphosate study is based on our partnership, and please, I hope you can visit our website, where also a crowdfunding campaign has been organized to support the study. And the study includes very many authoritative partners, independent partners from all over the world, from Boston College, University of California, Mount Sinai School of Medicine, George Mason University. And it's based on a pilot phase where we did assess 1 dose and 2 test substances and just a limited number of endpoints, while in the integrated phase we did 3 dose, 3 test substances, and many more endpoints. So first of all, what are the findings of the pilot study? Where again, we address doses that are currently considered safe in the US, so 1.75 milligram per kilogram of body weight. And we address both glyphosate and its formulation, Roundup Bioflo. Publications already raised different concerns on microbiome or endocrine effects, and we'll look at some of them now, and more of them will be discussed by our colleague, Professor Antoniou, after my talk. So indeed, already at the pilot study level, we did find PUPS alteration of the microbiome when exposure started from pregnancy. We did see that not only microbiome was altered, but also there was an alteration of the metabolome connected with this microbiome alteration. We did observe increased micronuclei. Micronuclei are a biomarker of genotoxicity. And again, we are talking about doses that are allegedly safe. And we did observe this effect also in light, and when we heard about the classification from IARC, the classification of probable carcinogens was based on an increase of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And it's important to have in mind that micronuclei increase are frequently associated with substances that are capable of inducing lymphoma or leukemia. We did observe increased anogenital distance, which is rare. It's more common to observe shortening of anogenital distance. Increased anogenital distance along with increased testosterone in females, along with a delay in the first estrus in female. And not only we did observe this in our experimental study, which were on Sprague-Dawley rats and were standard in terms of toxicology as model, because Sprague-Dawley rats is the most used model that we use in toxicology, but these findings were actually confirmed in humans. In a very large cohort in the US, a multicentric study did observe anogenital distance increased in newborns exposed during pregnancy, and the level of maternal urinary exposure, the higher levels were associated with increased anogenital distance. Then we did also observe alteration of the length of gestation in mothers exposed during pregnancy to glyphosate. Further to that, we also did some mechanistic studies to investigate, for example, whether glyphosate was behaving like glycine. Glyphosate is phosphonomethylglycine, allegedly, according to someone, an analog of glycine. So glycine is an amino acid, doesn't give any side effect in humans, so we wanted to see in vitro whether glyphosate and its formulation were more behaving like glycine or not. And here are the results. So indeed, glyphosate and its formulation were showing cytotoxicity, while no cytotoxicity was observed in glycine. So this mechanistic study is more consistent with a behavior as an organophosphate rather than a behavior as an analog of glycine. So the integrated phase of the study, largest study ever performed on pesticides, over 5,000 animals were used for this study. We did start from the admittable daily intake in the EU, so 0.05 milligram per kilogram of body weight, And not only we did study Roundup Bioflo, so European formulation, but also formulations that include POEA from the US, which is not allowed to be used in Europe, up to 50 milligram per kilogram of body weight, which is the NOAEL, allegedly a dose that should give no adverse effect in toxicological studies. So 9 treated groups and 1 control. And we did study very many outcomes from carcinogenicity, short-term, long-term toxicity, prenatal developmental toxicity, neurotoxicity, multi-generational toxicity, endocrine disruption, and microbiome. And we'll hear more about the first findings on the microbiome from Professor Antoniou. I'm trying to switch the slide, but it looks a little stuck. But what we did already observe were alteration of the microbiome that will, again, be described in more detail later. And this was observed already, again, at doses that are considered safe with a dose response. And we did already observe also an alteration of kidney and liver in the arm, which is a subchronic toxicity study, which starts from prenatal exposure up to 13 weeks of age. So this means young adult animals. They generally don't have this kind of lesions. To summarize what we did observe that the doses that are considered safe in the EU cause statistically significant effects on different endpoints. Endocrine disrupting effects were observed in the pilot study, then were confirmed in human cohorts. We did see dose-dependent alteration of microbiome. And again, this was true for glyphosate-based herbicides, so not only glyphosate, but also its formulation, and generally the formulation had more detrimental effects. Liver and kidney were also observed as target organs for the glyphosate-based herbicides. Carcinogenicity study results will be available in late October, and indeed, as for many independent studies, we need urgent support because it's not easy to find fundings for independent science. With this, I would like to thank you all, to thank all the team at the Ramazzini Institute, and in particular Dr. Bua, which recently passed away and was a cornerstone of our studies for 35 years and gave a great contribution to this study too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniele. I think it's really very impressive to see all this evidence being put together, and it is really a bit disconcerting that this evidence is something that doesn't seem to have an impact on decision making by the Commission and the Member States. Also, I think it is really unfortunate that the timetable is very, very strict. So we heard from Klaus Behrendt that the Member States will start debating on September, and that a decision should already been taken in October at the time where your study is going to be published. And I do believe that it would be a good idea to have also more time by independent experts to scrutinize the data that ECHA and EFSA have based their opinion on, because this is, as far as I know, not yet fully published. So it is a bit difficult to say, okay, we assessed everything, but we don't want to let anyone know before we take a decision. And there I think we would do a bit, let's say, more prudent in postponing the decision to give external experts also the opportunity to have a look at the data and the studies which have led to the recommendation by the Commission. But now, without further ado, I would like to give over to, I'll say just Mr. Antoniou, so I don't make an error in pronunciation, who is head of the Gene Expression and Therapy Group at King's College London. And he has been leading scientific research on glyphosate and glyphosate formulations for many, many years, and therefore his findings, of course, are very relevant pieces in glyphosate science. Michael, your team published several scientific research on the effect of glyphosate. Do you feel that those findings were adequately taken into account?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, and I will answer it at the end of my presentation. So the title, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, actually congratulate the organizers for arranging this meeting, because as Christophe alluded to at the beginning, it's people's lives and environmental being that are at stake here. So it couldn't be any more important. So thank you for inviting me. So the title of my presentation is Multi-Organ Toxicity from Glyphosate and Roundup at Regulatory Relevant Doses. So the first thing we need to bear in mind before I start going through the results of our studies is that pesticides of all sorts used by farmers and domestically are never used as active principles alone. Yes, what you buy consists of an active ingredient, but it's always mixed with a number of other chemicals known as co-formulants that perform various different functions. And what you see on the bottom left of the slide here are some of the co-formulants that are in different glyphosate-based herbicide formulations. And the reason why we have to consider formulations as well as active ingredients in pesticide risk assessment is that pesticide co-formulants and adjuvants are up to 1,000 times more toxic than the active ingredient. Unfortunately, they're usually not disclosed and largely ignored by regulators during pesticide risk assessment. No long-term toxicity testing required. So for me, given this evidence, any pesticide risk assessment that ignores the co-formulants is actually negligent. This co-formulant in the red box here, Dogogen 4022, is the main co-formulant in Roundup MON 52276. This is the European Union reference glyphosate-based herbicide formulation, and I'll be showing you results of our toxicity studies using exactly this formulation. We thought it relevant because it is the European Union reference formulation. So in this study, which we conducted jointly with the Ramazzini Institute with Daniele here, is that we took young adult rats and we exposed them to either to glyphosate alone or MON 52276 at the European Union ADI, which is 0.5 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day, the European Union no observed adverse effect level of 50 milligrams, and the United States no observed adverse effect level dose of 175 milligrams. We had 12 animals per group, and this entire study was conducted in accord with OECD and GLP criteria. And the range of measures we had ranged from gut microbiome evaluation, general toxicity using classical type measures, and also we used cutting-edge molecular profiling methods to give us a much deeper and we hope much more sensitive toxicity readout. So the first, I should say, the work I'm going to present to you summarizes from two publications, as you can see in the bottom right hand here. So the first study, published in 2022, I only have time to go through our findings rather than through the actual raw data. But our first finding was that glyphosate and MON 52276 disturb gut microbiome at doses regulators say are safe. So glyphosate and Roundup disrupt the gut microbiome by the same mechanism that glyphosate acts as a weed killer in plants, i.e. inhibition of the shikimate biochemical pathway. And that this microbiome was altered at all doses, causing shifts in bacterial populations. And these effects happen even at low doses, the no observed adverse effect level and the ADI, which regulators assert should have no adverse effects and are safe. And this study was the first to describe a key mechanism by which glyphosate and a Roundup formulation can affect the function of the gut microbiome. And that this may be mirrored in humans as well. In a follow-up study, which is part of the global glyphosate study that Daniele told us about just a few minutes ago, the difference here is that the animals began to be exposed to both glyphosate and the Roundup formulations prenatally, mid-gestation. And in this study, we found far more dramatic effects on the gut microbiome in terms of composition. Bacterial composition diversity was reduced, fungal composition diversity was increased. And exposure to both glyphosate and the different Roundup formulations, starting at the fetal stage, resulted in these more dramatic changes in the gut microbiome compared to exposure starting in young adulthood. And that glyphosate and the Roundup formulations reduce colonization resistance and bacterial colonization resistance and allowed opportunistic, potentially pathogenic fungi to grow in the gut. Now, we also looked, in addition to the gut in these rats, we looked at the effects of the Roundup MON572 on the effects of this in blood biochemistry as well, and also gut biochemistry, using cutting-edge molecular profiling methods. And what we found was that using biochemical composition profiles known as metabolomics, we showed that there was oxidative stress response in both the gut and the blood, and that the Roundup MON52276 was more disruptive than the glyphosate. And the importance of this, of course, is that oxidative stress damages not only cells and organs, but also DNA, and can lead to serious disease such as cancer. And that, indeed, as alluded to by Peter Klausing, epidemiological studies have shown oxidative stress and DNA damage responses following occupational exposure to glyphosate-based herbicides. So we have a human epidemiology supporting what we see in our animal studies. In the follow-up investigation we did, the blood profiling, metabolomics profiling, suggested that glyphosate and Roundup MON52276 damaged the rats' livers. So we did a follow-up investigation of the liver to confirm whether that was indeed the case. So we did two sets of analyses, the standard tests currently demanded by regulators for market authorization of pesticides, blood biochemistry and kidney and liver histopathology, microscopic examination, and then we did a whole range of non-standard tests not demanded by regulators using cutting-edge molecular profiling methods. So the findings from the standard tests were that histopathology and blood biochemistry analysis, we saw a dose-dependent adverse effect from the Roundup MON52276 and statistically significant increases in fatty liver disease and liver cell deaths, steatosis and necrosis. And that this finding of fatty liver disease in these animals confirmed earlier studies from my group that showed that rats fed an incredibly low dose of a Roundup formulation, Grand Trevo Plus, at approximately 40,000 times below the glyphosate European Union acceptable daily intake, fed to the rats for 2 years, caused non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So and also in human epidemiological studies have confirmed these fatty liver associated findings with glyphosate and Roundup, and that there's a strong association between glyphosate and Roundup exposure and fatty liver disease, and that the increase in liver and kidney lesions seen in our animals fed glyphosate, although they did not reach statistical significance, a longer-term experiment is warranted to see whether this trend does reach statistical significance. I'll just skip that. So non-standard tests were most revealing. So Roundup MON52276 altered expression of 96 genes in the liver linked to oxidative stress and DNA damage, and also disrupted circadian rhythms of the body's clocks. Most affected genes reflective of DNA damage in liver also had their expression similarly altered in kidneys. This is a crucial point here. Core gene expression changes reflective of oxidative stress and DNA damage were exactly the same from both the Roundup MON52276 and from the animals treated with just glyphosate alone. So these gene expression and DNA damage changes that we saw must be due to the glyphosate and not the coformulants present in the MON52276. And we also showed that direct DNA damage was caused by just glyphosate alone in the liver. And the discovery that glyphosate alone damages DNA should, under current EU pesticide law, result in a ban on this chemical. And in addition, our molecular profiling looked at epigenetic changes, which suggested cancer-causing ability, glyphosate and the Roundup MON52276. We saw massive changes in epigenetic DNA methylation profiling and also in small regulatory RNA profiling. Both of these types of alterations are linked with a high frequency at a high frequency in cancer. We also did a series of tissue culture cell assays with the Dutch company Toxis, where they have a series of tissue culture cell assays that looks at gene expression changes that are linked with cancer, and therefore you get a readout of the carcinogenicity potential of a chemical. And we found that 2 herbicide Roundup formulations, including MON52276, give us an oxidative stress and a misfolded protein response, which are clear markers of carcinogenicity. And that glyphosate damaged DNA, the damage that we saw DNA in living animals from glyphosate were not highlighted in these cell culture assays, which shows that the cell culture assays are clearly more limited than what you can have a readout in animals. So just to summarize what
You're concluding, right? You're concluding, right?
Yes, I'm concluding. So regulatory safe doses of glyphosate and Roundup shown to be unreliable. All doses of glyphosate and Roundup MON52276 tested cause some adverse effects. So the current EU glyphosate and Roundup, no observed adverse effect level and ADI are incorrect. And that glyphosate caused a whole spectrum, and the Roundup caused a whole spectrum of damage. And collectively, all these measures point to glyphosate and more so Roundup formulations as being potent risk factors for fatty liver disease and carcinogenicity. And that stronger adverse effects are coming from the Roundup formulations that glyphosate. So my question to the regulators is, why do regulators fail to require meaningful toxicological data, including long-term testing on the co-formulants? And that the adverse effects from glyphosate Roundup exposure are slow to become evident and may give rise to false sense of safety. And the other finding from our studies is that the cutting-edge molecular profiling methods show toxic effects that standard regulatory tests currently demanded by regulators will miss. And so my question to regulators is, when will regulators stop living in the dark ages and come into the 21st century and demand molecular profiling methods to be used as part of risk assessment?
Thank you very much, Michael.
There's one more.
Oh, sorry.
And my question to ECHA is, why were our studies as presented here not included in the ECHA opinion on glyphosate toxicity? And these are just to acknowledge my collaborators on the study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I would even add a question which is more, let's say, fundamental, taking into account that the statistically significant criterion was originally introduced to make sure that a medicine, an active ingredient which people are taking to treat a disease, is actually really working and not just by chance, so that you have a comparison to a placebo. But that in case of assessing whether something is dangerous, we should not say we have to be 95% sure that it is dangerous. So that's a more fundamental question we should ask ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I would like to introduce Johann Zaller. He's a research scientist at the Department of Integrative Biology and Biodiversity at the University of Natural Sciences and Life Sciences in Vienna. And you have been working a lot in the field of ecotoxicology, which is close to my heart because I used to work in that field also, and you have led several research on the effect of glyphosate formulation to soil health and to earthworms. So we are very interested to learn what's your opinion on the current use of glyphosate. Does it endanger soil health? Is it an acceptable risk for biodiversity? Johann, you have the floor. And again, 10 minutes, please.
On everybody from Vienna. I hope you can hear me well.
Perfectly well, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I will talk about the ecotoxicology of glyphosate from the perspective of an ecologist. And you know, we ecologists, we have a systems approach. We like to study interactions between species and the environment and so on. Next slide, please. But before I dive into the topic, I would like you to remind you on one of the biggest threats to nature, that's the loss in biodiversity. And as you can see here from the Living Planet Index, monitoring more than 3,700 species across all continents, we have a steady decline in biodiversity. In Europe, minus 24% from the 1970s to now. But in Latin America, for instance, minus 94%. And the next shows the threats to biodiversity. Of course, it's the change in land and sea use, habitat loss, degradation, species overexploitation, invasive species, diseases, pollution, and climate change. And now you might wonder, okay, what does this has to do with glyphosate actually? The next shows that glyphosate is involved in changes in sea and land use because glyphosate enables very intensive agriculture with monocultures and the loss of other habitats. Next. Also, invasive species are stimulated by the use of glyphosate because a lot of weed species are resistant to glyphosate already. Next. Of course, glyphosate pollutes a lot of environments. We will see it later. And next, glyphosate, like all other synthetic pesticides, are made of fossil fuels and emit in their production a lot of greenhouse gases. Next, please. A couple of months ago, we published a review article on terrestrial ecotoxicity of glyphosate and its formulations. We've heard before how important formulations actually are and the co-formulants contained in those glyphosate-based herbicides. And I don't have time to go into details, but you can see here the arrows going down, going up. So it's an increase or a decrease of the specific parameters featured here. And you can see here, of course, effects on plants because it's a herbicide, but we can also see effects on microorganisms, on lots of soil biota, so changes in the activity of soil biota, a decrease in reproduction, increase in the mortality of insects or the navigation of honeybees, for instance, and so on and so on. Even with vertebrate species like birds or other terrestrial vertebrates, we see DNA damages and things like that. The next slide shows, next please. Just as a summary of this review, it's published and openly available so everybody can read it. We have found many unintended side effects on many terrestrial organisms, including mammals. Next. The important mechanism we identified was actually oxidative stress with effects on biochemistry and DNA damage. Next. disruption of various physiological, behavioral, and ecological processes. Next. What we also found was that most of the studies only use study short-term effects on a single glyphosate application or glyphosate-based herbicides to a single species. Next. And that's actually not what's going on in the field in agricultural practice. You all know this. We have 2 to 3 glyphosate applications per season. We have interactions with other agrochemicals that is not at all considered in these environmental risk assessments. And we have ecological interactions within the field and with the landscape also. Next. And what it's important to stress is in the majority of cases we studied or we reviewed was that the toxicity of glyphosate-based herbicides, so the herbicides that are actually used in the field by the farmers, exceeds the toxicity of glyphosate active ingredient. And that means that the so-called inert co-formulants are either toxic by themselves or add to the toxicity of glyphosate. Next, please. And I would like to stress this point as well. We are talking about glyphosate as if it is one clearly defined chemical, but it's not. When you look in the pesticide property database of the University of Hertfordshire, the most comprehensive pesticide database, we see at least 8 different species of glyphosate. And sometimes we just don't know what's in the products, but we know that they have effects on the environment, on the ecotoxicity, and even on the human health. Next, please. And it's also important, next, please. Yes. These glyphosate-based herbicides, which are used in the field, contain the glyphosate as the active principle, the active ingredient, lots of co-formulants and impurities. This is not so new result, but it's usually ignored. And these are heavy metals such as arsenic, chromium, cobalt, lead, and nickel. And this also has to be taken into account when assessing the environmental aspects. Next, please. Yeah, the problem is that glyphosate just contaminates all ecosystem on our planet. I just cite here 2 studies, one from a global aspect, global review, with aquatic contamination of glyphosate, and below is a newer study conducted in Europe, where also 74% of the samples had glyphosate or the metabolite AMPA contained in the water, and often the water would not be safe for human consumption. Next, please. And we know that glyphosate is present in our soils, of course, because it's sprayed onto the soil. 80% of the soils were with pesticide contamination. Most frequently found were glyphosate, and the next was already DDT. Just as a reminder, this has been banned like 30 years ago. Next, please. Recently, we found glyphosate also in ambient air. We set up these passive air samplers in eastern Austria, found 67 pesticides. Glyphosate was present everywhere, even in national parks and in the city center of Vienna, for instance, where the next application field of glyphosate is kilometers away. Next, please. There are very subtle effects of glyphosate in the ecosystem we don't understand yet fully. For instance, we have direct effects of glyphosate on fungi and bacteria, which share the same shikimate pathway than plants. And we have to consider that plants always communicate with insects, with pollinators, with herbivores, with neighboring plants. There's a phytohormone crosstalk going on. And this is being disrupted by glyphosate, which has been shown by this group in Finland. Next, please. We also found, for instance, when we spray glyphosate in a vineyard, you actually change the nutrient content of the crop, so of the grape wine, even of the grape juice. And we could find this even 11 months after the application of glyphosate. So we have long-term effects going on, which are usually ignored in official environmental risk assessments. Next, please.
Johann, could you speed up a bit? Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Why should we care? We can skip this because ecological interactions are important. Next, please. Next. You can skip also the next slide. It's about ecosystem services which are provided and which are super important. And now we go to the EFSA conclusions. I just picked two conclusions on ecotoxicology. Next, please. So they concluded there's a high long-term risk to mammals. Just as a reminder, humans are also mammals. Next, please. And so I'm just wondering, was the precautionary principle even considered here? Next, please. And the next conclusion is on biodiversity. And when I read this, I was really upset, I have to confess. Next, please. Because the risks for biodiversity are complex and depend on multiple factors. Okay, yes. Next. There's a lack of harmonized methods, obviously. There are a lack of species protection goals, and risk managers can consider mitigation measures. Next, please. Well, complex and multiple factors, this usually comes up when somebody doesn't want to conclude anything. A lack of harmonized methodologies. You can be sure that scientists usually use the most appropriate methods to study something. And specific goals, there's no lack in specific protection goals. Our goal is to protect the environment and halt the loss of biodiversity. That's even legally binding. And the risk managers can consider mitigation measures. Well, what if they simply don't care to consider mitigation measures? What can we do? And such a conclusion, in my opinion, is a disrespect of biodiversity and ecological science. And with the next slide, I would like to conclude. We can skip over this. Because the problem is the official risk assessment is just not assessing what is happening in the field. And if this is so inadequate, actually we should be more cautious in evaluating the outcomes. And with this, I would like to show that actually glyphosate is not necessary for successful farming. We don't need this. We don't need herbicides at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johann. And I had a few of the same thoughts as you have just voiced, but as we are really behind our time schedule, I would like to, without further ado, pass over to Xavier Rebou, who will also join us remotely. He's research director as INRAE, which is a public research institute working for coherent and sustainable development of agriculture, food, and the environment. And Xavier, we often hear that beside we can acknowledge that glyphosate is not the best substance, we have to use it because there are no alternatives. But we know that there are farmers out there who work without glyphosate. So what is, in your opinion, the way forward for feeding Europeans without that substance? Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah?
Perfectly well, yes.
Merci beaucoup. Et donc,
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor. This issue is extremely important to see what the French farmers are doing. Glyphosate is successful because it has three characteristics that other substances don't have. It will kill all the vegetable and the systems. It can come in the leaves, but also in the roots and destroy them. Its use is very practical. We can use the glyphosate and we can sow the next day without fear. Therefore, the price even is extremely interesting. It's 30 euro per hectare, often even lower than this. In the big farming plants, we see the typical activities of a farmer who uses glyphosate in the top pictures. How do we compare? How can we stop weeds to grow with glyphosate or mechanically, you can substitute one with the other. It's better if the soil preparation is in optimal condition, we can spare the use of glyphosate. However, in many cases, the farmer will prefer to use the glyphosate because it allows it to prepare the field earlier, and it is quicker to manage. The wheat can then start in a healthy situation of the soil, so it can organize the soil preparation at the last minute. And this implies two risks: the weather being favorable and the presence of a lot of weeds that are more difficult to destroy. Here, if we want to summarize, with the glyphosate, the action can be alternated with mechanical means, and with we can control better, and we can begin on an healthy basis and earlier. Without the glyphosate, we could be obliged to do more mechanical intervention in a very short time, and glyphosate gives a bigger flexibility on a big exploitation. Here we see what happens in perennial farming. We can see on a soil that is always bare or always with grass. There are many methods with many advantages or disadvantages. The risk of soil erosion is quite important, and also it is important to maintain the humidity. Glyphosate is used when we want to destroy low vegetation, and this is done with mechanical means on the left, but the chemical means are quicker. They do not harm, they do not damage the irrigation system, and the quality is perennial. Then you don't depend on the availability of workers and the availability of mechanical means. There are many methodologies and available data. We have analyzed 3,000 farmers in France, the methods, the comparison of the methods and the use or not has taken into account the size of the agricultural exploitation, the logistics, and it mobilizes the proportion score, as we say. With this data, half of the farmers can spare the use of glyphosate. They work the soil, they are concerned by the method of exploitation, and they choose what is best for them. It's also based on the consumptions, and which doesn't seem to have a huge impact. So maybe there's more use of workers, manual work, when there's no glyphosate involved. I will not go into detail in this case, but we could substitute and reconstruct the systems. We'll give you this document, which contains a lot of information. Since 2017, we come to the same conclusion as other studies. We have seen how the experts in many countries placed in the whole European countries. I will send this full document. Whenever people wanted to not use glyphosate, life was made very difficult, apparently, and right to left, you can see the mechanical means are very difficult in certain areas, and the quality of the industrial productions is compromised, as well as the soil conservation. So 100% of the conservancy farmers will use glyphosate. This type of agriculture is representing 3 or 4% of the whole surface. And this type of agriculture has been constructed because glyphosate was available. On the European level, no, maybe there's a problem with the slides. Okay. Next. I'm sorry, I got lost, says the speaker. Half of the parcels in Europe does not receive glyphosate, but that means that if they don't receive it in 1 year, they won't receive it on the other year. If all the parcels would get 1 out of 2 years the glyphosate, what we want to know is, can we not use it? The situation in an year where the situation is more complicated for farmers. In the slide, you can see, we can show how, in the case of grapevines, it depends on a region. On the region, we have a variation between 12 and 250 euro per hectare. And it takes a long time for the plant to reconstitute its roots. So we need to make the choice to avoid the use of glyphosate, and they will be able to then they will have to recoup the price on the selling price of the grapes, and therefore the economical reason is a very strong one. There were uses of glyphosate for which there is an alternative that is non-chemical, and on this basis we refer to the Article 51, and on the use of glyphosate in France. Glyphosate is not authorized, and you can't use it on more than 1/3 of the surface of perennial crops. I come to the conclusion the dependency is either zero or a strong dependency according to the type of crop. There is a will of not touching in the soil. There are other means, like mechanical means, to work. We need to understand and clarify the uses that are less pertinent for this substance. The next slide will give you the references of my talk. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Xavier. And I think it was very important. What are the alternatives? And of course, you were very much focused on France and vineyards, which is not the rule all over Europe, but I'm sure we can all learn from this. And we're a bit behind schedule, so I pass over to Angeliki for your conclusions before asking Commission ECHA and EFSA on their views of what they have heard today.
Thank you, Chair. We heard a lot of interventions presenting evidence that glyphosate might not be safe after all, despite the conclusions that we recently had from European Food Safety Authority. I'm going to give a civil society perspective and also looking a little bit closer on what the regulation says that was voted in this parliament. more than 10 years ago. So as was highlighted also earlier by the Commission, yes, it's the law which was previously a directive and it turned into a regulation to be legally binding, aims to ensure a high level of protection for human, animal health and the environment. This includes the protection of vulnerable groups of our population, children, but also biodiversity and ecosystems. So it's the industry that has to demonstrate that the products are safe. That means the active substances, all the ingredients that the product contains and the product as itself, as well as the residues it leaves in the environment. The assessment has to be independent, transparent, objective, with no conflict of interest, and it has to use the most recent scientific science. That's often this is actually from a peer-reviewed scientific literature. And it tells that it has to apply, it is based on the precautionary principle, therefore, if there is some uncertainties, decision can still be taken. Now, we agree with the regulation, but what we don't agree with is the way it's implemented. We consider that how it has been implemented, it has serious shortcomings, which you heard in the previous presentations, and I'm going to focus on a couple of points here. So, unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the cancer assessment because it has been sufficiently covered by our colleagues earlier. And as EFSA said, they have taken the ECHA assessment at face value, so they haven't changed anything on the hazard classification. So I'm going to go straight into the EFSA's peer review when it comes to the toxicity of other areas. And one that I would like to focus on is, first of all, ask the question that, is the carcinogenicity of glyphosate active substance just the tip of the iceberg? Yes, it is. And this is also what EFSA has actually found in its own conclusions. So we sent a letter to EFSA, and thank you for your reply as well. And here I'm just going to focus on some of the findings that we raised concerns. And these, yes, but yeah, so let's start. So the first point is that EFSA, in its assessment, it identified that there were some issues with one impurity. It was found to be genotoxic. And also with a conformulant, and we heard earlier from Professor Antoniou that conformulants are not as thoroughly tested as active substances, but nevertheless there was a data gap for this substance. However, the EFSA concluded that this is not a critical area of concern, and as we heard before, this means that the approval criteria are still met. So this.
We're going to be thrown out of this room in 10 minutes.
Okay.
And,
right,
I would like to hear from the Commission, ECHA and EFSA also what they think of what they've heard.
Okay, I will be really fast. So they raised also issues on the microbiome, as we heard earlier, and neurotoxicity, as well as biodiversity. And they said that these are not critical areas of concern, and of course we disagree, as you find out. And why we disagree? Because as it was explained by the European Court of Justice in the court case that we know as the Blaze ruling, it says that the product, in order to authorize a product, you have to show that all its ingredients and the product as a whole should have no long-term carcinogenicity or toxicity. And we've seen that this has not happened in the current assessment of the product, and we will see this, and I'll show you why. So this just comes from the assessment report. This is the renewal assessment report, and here this is another particular case. This is a data requirement for an active substance. You see on one column glyphosate, and then the product, the representative formulation that has been assessed. And the first part is acute toxicity, is lethal dose 50. We really don't want this to go in the market. But as you can see further down, you can see all the studies that have been submitted for the active substance and for the product. And as you can see, the only study that has been submitted in the whole product is an in vitro test on genotoxicity. There are actually 2 types, and no other long-term toxicity or carcinogenicity. Therefore, the way that we understand the Blaze ruling, the Court of Justice decision, is that the industry has to show that the whole product has no carcinogenicity or long-term toxicity. And in this case, despite all the evidence, we see that this has not been done. And here is our reality check, that it has disregarded all the evidence from the scientific literature on the product, and we don't even have long-term toxicity tests on the individual ingredients of the product. Here, just want to come back to the same ruling that says that we need to implement the precautionary principles. So even if we don't take all the evidence into account that was presented today as solid evidence, we can still have some suspicion that maybe something is going on. And based on this uncertainty, our regulators can take a decision and not renew the license of glyphosate. And this is our conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for making up so much time which we lost earlier, which was not your fault, rather mine, actually. But I would like to hear from our experts from the Commission, from ECHA and from EFSA. What do you think of what you have heard today? And please stick to 3 minutes each. Yeah, 2 minutes each, because people are outside already waiting. Who wants to start?
Do we start? You can hear us? Thank you. I hope you can hear us. Many thanks to all the speakers today. Very interesting. Maybe I start with saying we understand very much the interest in this topic and the reason for debate. And as always, we welcome discussion on it. What I would like to maybe emphasize is that this is a unique substance in a way. There is so much data out there. We're only really scratching the surface today in the discussion we had in 2 hours now. But we have lots and lots of data, all of which was included in our process, like I explained in the slides earlier. On the science, I think scientific debate is very healthy. There is plenty of science in our process too. Like I explained, the regulatory process really takes the science and provides a framework to assess it. So we look at the CLP criteria, we look at all the data, positive and negative findings, and we use weight of evidence to come to a conclusion. So our opinion is based on a robust dossier by scientists across Europe from 4 member states, like we explained, who checked all the data in detail, provided us with the dossier, which was scrutinized by RAC last year, over the course of a year. Most of the issues that were raised today, I think, were covered in our process already. So as I said, we had a very open process and opportunities to discuss. And many of the speakers here today were present in the proceedings and had an opportunity to give their view, which was listened to and considered by RAC. Everything is covered in the opinion. It should be clear. We also have our website with lots of information and our previous responses to other events. So as always, if there's anything more detailed, we're happy to discuss and clarify. But maybe I'll leave it there and pass to the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the floor is to EFSA.
Yeah, thank you. Quick reaction. It was said several times we looked at all studies. We also looked at all studies. I have to say that there's an extremely long list of studies we looked at. And the fact that we might come at different outputs and these might not be liked, it doesn't mean that we are less good at one. We have done conclusions that were appreciated by this group here. In particular, I still struggle with the fact that for some reasons, the things we've written, completely different, are reported wrongly. Angeliki, the impurity you mentioned is not listed as genotoxic, and it's clearly explained. And I don't know why we are not able to pass the message that the conclusion is not yet final. So we can't say that it's genotox. Still, you keep on saying it's genotox. So I would be glad if you could publish the reply from your letter, the reply from Bernardo, straight away. It could have been nice to present it today because it contains a lot of clarifications. And another point on the results from Ramazzini. Actually, I understand that they will be ready in October. And I sent the letter. I'm still waiting for the reply, actually, when we mentioned, OK, if you have preliminary results, because if you publish in October, very likely the results of the long-term studies are already available. And we haven't seen, we would have been glad to include them in the assessment. And this didn't happen. We engaged with you, but this didn't go through. Sorry for this, it's a lost opportunity, but of course, anything that will come will be taken on board. And just to conclude on the statement that mammals are, humans are also mammals, I'm sorry. This is a basic concept that the reason why we have ecotox assessment with different tools than human is made for scientific reason of different exposure, different way to assess the effects on the organ. So frankly, I think that using this funny sentence to say that biodiversity hasn't been looked at, and in general the ecotox risk assessment is unfair because all studies in the ecotox assessment.
Sorry, I would like to hear something from the Commission in the remaining 30 seconds.
Has been looked at and has been assessed with traceable criteria. Just, sorry, Ms. Chairman, but we've had 5 minutes plus 2 compared to 2 hours of the arrest. So thank you for your patience.
And just to add, and I thank ECHA and EFSA for their responses. For the Commission, as I said in the beginning, Mrs. Chair, the EFSA conclusion and the ECHA opinion are the benchmarks. And obviously, when we get letters, be it from PAN in this case, or in other cases from the applicants who are not happy with the conclusions of EFSA, we always go back to the agencies and ask them to look at the arguments and tell us whether they have merit or whether they have already been considered or whether there's anything really new compared to what they looked at and whether that had an impact on their conclusions. And that's what we have also done in this case. We already got letters and we expect answers from EFSA and ECHA. And for us, the key is there really anything new that was not already considered on the way to the EFSA conclusion and the RAC opinion? The presentation by Mr. Rebaud was very interesting about the alternatives, but let me also emphasize that whether alternatives exist or not is not a criterion on approval or renewal of approval. It is very well something that the member states can take into account when they decide on authorizations of products. And France has done that, as Mr. Rebaud has clarified, and we expect that the other member states do exactly the same in this two-step system of approval of active substance at European level and authorization of products at member state level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And sorry, I was a very bad timekeeper, but it is always a problem when you have so much information in such a short time. And please excuse the ones that are wanting to use this room now. And I think everyone could also address his or her questions to the ones who took part in this event, and the professors will also be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.